Ali Gad, I'd like to welcome you to the final in our series of Everyday Orientalism talks for 2020. Really glad to see so many people with us today, whether you're on Zoom, Facebook Live, or watching us on YouTube. Could I ask everybody to please turn off their microphone and camera just to save some bandwidth? And we won't be using the, thank you, I can see people doing this already. And we won't be using the chat box during the talk itself, but you're welcome to post questions in the chat after the speaker has finished. So today we're welcoming Dr. ROBERTA MAZZA, who is lecturer in Greco-Roman material culture at the University of Manchester and a very long-standing friend of most of us at Everyday Orientalism. She's currently working on a book entitled The Secret Life of Manuscripts, and many of us will be familiar with her work through her blog, Faces and Voices, People, Artifacts and Ancient History, looking at the trade in papyri. And you can also find her on Twitter at Papyrology@Man, for Papyrology at Manchester, I imagine. So today she's going to be talking to us about powerful text things, papyrology and the material turn. So welcome, Roberta, and we look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you. Now the difficult thing, which is sharing the screen. Okay. Okay, so what I'm presenting today is slightly different from what I promised in my the abstract that I provided at the very beginning of, thinking about this series. It's that talk, but I will indulge, so to speak, more on the papyrus cases rather than the sort of theoretical framework on how to conceive papyri as manuscripts and cultural heritage objects. That will be the core of an article that is actually forthcoming, description and the materiality of texts that you see in this list of publications that somehow are connected with my research about papyrology and the antiquities market. I must say that my interest in the topic stemmed from two life events. The first was coming to Manchester in 2009 and becoming one of the custodians of the collection that we have there. So I started thinking about many things, about being a gatekeeper, about how to take care of these objects and how to handle also the unsettling stories on how they came to Manchester. The other big event in the life of every one of us, I guess, at this point, was the announcement in 2014 of the new Sappho fragments that dragged me into a number of other issues, including the meeting with the Museum of the Bible and the Green Papyri that I have written and talked about extensively in recent years. So let's start with this paper then. In February 2014, we were told a tale of discovery regarding the finding of new Sappho papyri. At that time, the tale convinced the largest part of the audience. Newspapers were quick to cover the story. Classicists flocked to the media to provide translations, opinions, and joyful speeches. Those who were shyer joined a blog. I must do this, sorry about that. Joined a blog discussion set up by the discoverer of the fragment that saw a long stream of questions and opinions, but not a single answer. The real story of the new Sappho fragments that has unfolded from the moment until now is at some extent extraordinary for the characters involved and the level of deception. Nevertheless, what pushed me to intervene back in February 2014 and to persist in the following years, despite attempts were made to convince me to give up, was the fact that the tale looked to me both familiar and wrong. After all, I thought that there was nothing really new about a male papyrologist affiliated to a top university keen on publishing an interesting, incredibly interesting papyrus of undocumented provenance, as the story of papyrology has been punctuated by similar episodes. But in 2014, that line of academics started looking a bit too long, and the zeitgeist, in the meanwhile, had profoundly changed. So I thought that a reaction was needed. Here you can see a sort of periodization about that I dealt with in some of my publications about the story of papyrology. And I want to be clear on this, that is, I do think that we need to historicize papyrus findings in the different phases of the history of papyrology. So of course, for me, after especially the 2011 Arab Revolution and all the cases about looting and other problems that we have observed, opened, so to speak, a new phase in which we had to be more proactive. In this paper, I'm going to argue that first, rather than being an isolated case, the new Sappho story is symptomatic of a very problematic way in which ancient manuscripts have been conceptualized and dealt with in our fields, and more broadly in textual-oriented disciplines. For instance, in biblical studies, Dead Sea Scroll studies have had similar issues to the one faced by classicists. Second, that the various episodes of publication of manuscripts of undocumented, if not patently illegal provenance, must be framed in the historical context in which each one of them took place. That is what I was saying in the previous slides. In other words, there is a huge difference between publishing a papyrus of undocumented provenance in 2014 or having done so in 1914. 3. That is our duty as classicists to acknowledge that we have been too late in joining the discussion about cultural heritage, misappropriation, and colonialism that archaeologists have addressed since at least the 1970s. 4, that current narratives about the birth of papyrology and the first papyrus discoveries, which have informed our teaching and research tradition, have had a huge role in the normalization of episodes like the new Sappho fragments discovery and the field slow reaction to acknowledge that what was unfolding was deeply wrong. So I would like to start from this last point about narratives of discovery and the history of papyrology. In official accounts of the history of papyrology, Oxyrhynchus occupies a prominent position. Every one of us who has written on any topic related to Greek, Roman, and Byzantine Egypt has had to do with the Oxyrhynchus papyri and has commented about the first discoveries of 1897. I myself made use of Grenfell and Hunt archaeological reports for the Egypt Exploration Society to reconstruct the late antique archive of the Apion's family in my book on the topic. As many before and after me, I selected the section of the report about the culmination of that season to stress the importance of the discovery with complete faith in the reliability of the account. For me, it was a celebration of the achievement reached by the fathers of British and world, actually, papyrology, and the model they became for the whole field. I accepted the tradition and I uncritically identified with it. It is widely known that was Petrie to initiate Grenfell to papyrus hunting through excavations and the Egyptian antiquities market. The young student revealed to be a quick learner in both, Since his first trip of 1893, he joined the crowd of scholars and collectors from various walks of life that spent each winter in the country in search for antiquities and to recover from British weather, in most cases. It was the Fayoum that opened his eyes to the immense possibilities of archaeological excavations for retrieving ancient writings. If one reads through reports and letters, it comes clear that Grenfell learned from Petrie how important it was to know the archaeological context of findings. Some passages from the opening of the archaeological report of 1895-1896 season in the Fayoum, co-author with Hogarth, are adamant about it, especially the last bit that I have put in bold. So provenance was there. The paragraph, however, is interesting also in other ways. It seems to suggest that Grenfell intended to remain in the Fayoum also for the following season of 1896-97, while not only he went to Oxyrhynchus al-Bahnasa, but he reported that the location was in his mind since a while, as we can read at the very beginning of the report for the EES. This oddity has been flagged in a recent article authored by Todd Hickey and Jim Keenan that I saw in the public, in which letters of Grenfell to the EES and Petrie about the campaign are published. However, Hickey and Keenan missed other key information available through the Journal of Petrie related to that season. The Journal of Petrie is a composition of the various reports, letters that he sent from the fields to Griffith and others. These journals have been published in various formats and are now all available through the Griffith Institute website. So it's there, but it was there well before the electronic version. Not without delays and difficulties, Petrie had obtained from the Antiquities Service a concession to excavate an area extending from the Fayoum to Minihe, including El Bahnasa, in the winter of 96-97. Before leaving Cairo for the concession, Petrie spent some time with a group of scholars like Edward Sayce, who were used to pass their winters in Egypt. He writes about having conversations about the deplorable state of antiquities. Matters are going worse and worse. There is no check on pillaging and places are being destroyed in any direction. The police and magistrates will not act. All we can do is to save from the wreck as much as possible while we can. All agree that Bahnasa is less worked out than any other region and think that I have a fine field. We can see here already in place these duplicitous attitudes of people like Petrie, Grenfell, and many others towards the market. On the one hand, they were, aware that the market and illicit excavations were ruining the archaeological records. But on the other hand, they were feeding the market. In fact, after these bits, there is a very interesting list of objects that actually Petrie had purchased before leaving for the season. So it's this problematic relationship between academics and the market that needs to be highlighted. Petrie left Cairo for El Bahnasa on November 30, while Grenfell and Hunt, who had just arrived in Cairo, stayed there for some time and moved to the site only later on December 20. In the following pages of the journal, we find Petrie busy with his Egyptian workforce, setting up the excavation house and exploring the neighborhood. I went over the immense mounds of Beneza, about a mile long and half-mile wide. All I saw was late Roman, excellent for Grenfell, but not for me. But there must be a fine cemetery here somewhere. I finally fixed on a piece of spare ground by the canal and surrounded with young palm groves to make our camp. While there, Petrie makes some acquaintances. Some local policemen were also looking for a spot to build a station, and towards sunset, a man joined the group, inviting all of them for dinner at his house. The person is never mentioned by name, but through his disability. For us, he will remain, and I'm quoting Petrie, the dumb man or our dumb friend. The dumb man was, and I'm quoting from Petrie, the dumb man was younger brother of a rich sheikh who is building a very grand house. He received us most cordially. Coffee, a long talk, and dinner followed. In fact, this man turned up knowing very well the remains of the ancient town. Petrie reports visiting the spoils left by centuries of quarrying in his company. It's about it's the section of the diary which relates to the 2nd to the 9th of December. He showed me the city wall at the end where it was scarcely visible, and went some way along it till I told him that I knew it and had planned it the day before. Then he told me that quantities of papyri were found there and began grabbing. In a couple of minutes, he turned up a piece of Greek accounts of 2nd century AD. But so soon as we got on the Arab part of the mounds, though I had not yet noticed the difference, he observed that there were not any papyri there. That was all no good, all of Muslim age. But the whole of the Roman part, not capped with Arab, contained writing. This passage is the first extant account of papyrus findings at Oxyrhynchus. It took place at the beginning of December 1896. It predates the arrival of Grenfell and Dant at the site and shows that papyri were found by a citizen of El Bahnaza who knew his own town's antiquities and was very well aware of what might have interested Petrie the most. Despite the letter of Petrie, as I said, have been published since a long time, this account has been overlooked and is lacking from any official discussion, even the most recent ones like Keenan, Hickey, but also Brent Nongbury, recent one, of the Oxyrhynchus papyri, because it did not meet what Europeans expect from tales of discovery. A wise male expert surrounded by secondary characters and local subordinates. We need to change these narratives because it stays at the core of the unethical ways in which we too often have handled Egyptian manuscripts. I am now going to look at a few examples of Sappho discoveries that, in my opinion, enlighten problems and issues which we still have to address, and in my opinion, have had a huge role in the wide acceptance of the tale of discovery back in 2014. Similarly to the last, although in a completely different legal and cultural context, the first fragment of Sappho that emerged from Egypt came from the antiquities market. It is a small late antique parchment, probably from a codex in the collection of the Berlin Museum, which was acquired by the diplomat Gustav Traves in 1877. It was said to have come from Medinet El Fayum, but as anything deriving from chains of dealers, this information should be taken with a pinch of salt. The verses in it are nowadays defined as from Sappho 3 and 4 and overlap with lines later found in an Oxyrhynchus papyrus, this one nowadays in Austria, 3424. I came to Sappho papyrology as an informed neophyte, someone who knows papyri, but never published or was even interested in literary papyri. I am a documentary person. The Berlin papyrus and 424 have overlapping verses, metric and vocabulary are Sapphic, I'm told. Nevertheless, it strikes me that the main preoccupation, so when I went to main editions, especially, you know, volumes that goes on the shelves in our libraries when we look for Sappho, or in bookshops where normal people, not academic, not only academics, are buying books, are not telling us a lot about these fragments. They are providing us these Sappho 3 and 4 without, for instance, explaining how things that for me are very interesting, like, for instance, in this case, we have a fragment coming from a codex, while Sappho is mainly transmitted through these scrolls of the previous period. So this is something that actually struck me the most. And while you don't find much on Sappho, the shape through which it came to us, and also the ways in which, of course, she was read, whatever that she might mean, to me is very relevant, and should be relevant also to the wider audience. So you can find a discussion on how to reconstruct a verse in these poems, but very little about the ways they came to us. So one first lesson I learned when going through the fragments is that Sappho papyrology has been dominated by male academics that at some point have decided that we needed to read her, Sappho, following the Hellenistic editions organized by male grammarians of the Ptolemaic court. Only one woman has ever provided a first edition of a new Sappho manuscript, an ostracon now in Florence. Medea Norsa published this ostracon, nowadays at the Vitelli in Florence, with verses attributed to Sappho in 1937. This is now Sappho 2. The finding caused the usual wave of commotion, as you can see from this letter from Harold Idris Bell that summarizes all this excitement, and as interesting overlaps with some of the tones that we had in 2014. Norsa's fate in fascist Italy has been treated at some extent in a wonderful book on the history of Italian papyrology, Luciano Canfora's Il Papiro di Dongo of 2005, which is a pity that it's not available in English and other languages. So it's a very, very interesting and fantastic book. While Medea Norsa was spared from racial persecution in spite of her half-Jewish roots, as soon as Vitelli died in 1935, she started experiencing the purge from her male colleagues. The publication of the Sappho was particularly badly digested by the group of more powerful and less gifted Italian male papyrologists surrounding Vitelli. Goffredo Coppola presented the fragment to the press as coming from the excavation of Breccia in Oxyrhynchus, which was either a gross mistake, the fragment in fact was purchased on the Egyptian market, and Norsa was another one who knew the market very well, or a provenance construction aimed at reattributing the important discovery to male agency. So Norsa is not only the only woman to have published a new Sappho papyrus, but also the only papyrologist whose career did not profited from this kind of achievement. Norsa had a remarkable track of publications, but although she taught papyrology at the University of Florence and at the Scuola Normale di Pisa, so she was an adjunct for her entire life on contracts until her death, she was consistently denied a chair in the subject. Although some have argued that this was a choice dictated by a form of resistance of Greek philologists to recognize papyrology as a subject, this has been argued in an article, for instance, of Pintaudi. The first chair in papyrology in Italy was indeed created in Florence in 1953, few months after Norsa's death, and went to Vittorio Bartoletti, a scholar certainly not as of the same level of Norsa, but who had the most important requirement of the time. He was a man. The problem of gender is strictly connected to the questions of academic power and hierarchy that had an impact on the development of the discussion surrounding the provenance of the new Sappho, as comments, for instance, in the Sappho blog demonstrate. We will see some of them later. We need to think carefully about these issues too. So publication of papyri in papyrology and related fields is giving us academic power, and academic power should be managed in different ways, in my opinion. The last Sappho papyri before the ones surfaced in 2014 came to light 10 years before and are in the possession of the University of Cologne. They have transmitted the so-called Titonos poem or poem of old age, and perhaps another poem, not by Sappho, as argued among others by John Landon in a fantastic article published in 2007, in which, the materiality, the shape of this fragment was really commented, and he made many interesting points about the way actually Sappho was used by other poets of the time and was also read in ways that are not so, well represented in standard editions of Sappho. This papyrus, in my opinion, invites some reflection as it shows that what scholars might think to be copies of Hellenistic editions of Sappho might easily be something else, and perhaps even more interesting when attention is paid to their material features, to go back to the disconnection between text and artifact that is so, that I was mentioning before as, a sort of recurrent theme in that thread of discussion that was made in the Sappho blog post, and you can follow in this particular part of the text that I highlighted. I wonder if the obsession with the reconstruction of the Hellenistic Alexandrian edition, which is reflected in modern canonical editions of Sappho and has occupied a great deal of the recent debates surrounding the two newest Sappho papyri, has been really useful to the understanding of how these verses circulated, were copied and read in Greek, Roman, and Byzantine Egypt. When the Cologne Sappho firstly appeared in ZPE, size, now with the English, the German will be horrible, Zeitschrift für Papyrologie und Epigraphik in 2004, nobody seemed to have objections relating to its provenance and the way it was presented to the public. As the first editors explained, the fragments had been acquired in 2002 with other 25 items on the antiquity market. Similarly to the Artemidorus, Posidippus, the Palladas epigrams at Yale, and other relatively recent cases, the audience did not receive full information about the Cologne Sappho collection history, and this, in my opinion, is never a good policy and practice. I want to stress that, of course, the case of the Cologne Sappho is very different from the last, London owner and green Sappho, first and foremost, because we have all access to these fragments. They are taken care of in a very important and very active collection. So it's very different here, the situation, also in other ways, of course. But still, there is a problem of, in my opinion, of transparency about the collection history of these and other items. The seller of Artemidorus, for instance, was supposed to be a collector, according to the first versions of the Tale of Discoveries, the discovery that, for instance, we were provided in the first exhibition catalog, and then ended up being a dealer with an interesting past, Serop Simonian. One source of many and relevant papyri recently landed in European and American collections, including Palladas, has been Frida Nussberger Chacos and of Gallery Nefer in Geneva, that has been at the center of various scandals and even condemned by an Italian court of law. I must say that Yale is doing a very good job with, being more transparent than in the past with the names of the dealer and, collection histories of their collection fragments. In difference to documenting acquisition circumstances and details that has persisted in the second phase of the history of papyrology, 1970-2011, had created, in my opinion, a fertile soil for the green papyri and new Sappho scandals. I want to be clear on this. I'm not saying that these papyri were all, or even from illegal sources, but simply that we are not in a position to express an informed opinion about it because we have not been provided access to documents and, those information that are indeed needed in order to form an opinion. I do think that, for instance, the problems connected with all the discussions surrounding the Artemidorus are much more coming from the origin of the fragments than the famous debate about forgery or not. As I have already pointed out, Grenfell was aware of the importance of archaeology for the interpretation of texts, and following generations of papyrologists have internalized the lesson and expanded it to the materiality of texts. London's analysis of the Cologne Sappho provides an example of this positive and fruitful attitude. But classicists with a more literary upbringing have been less aware of the importance of looking at the material features of papyri and much more anxious instead to reconstruct the original, the ur-text, if that even existed. I found resemblances here with New Testament scholars and theologians, and also this desperate search for and idolatry of the most ancient item attesting an author is another way of transforming these objects in powerful things, in sacred relics, I would say, even when the content is classical rather than biblical. Traces of this attitude are evident in what for me remains a most astonishing discussion, the one that took place in the block dedicated to the new Sappho. I remember feeling the absurdity of debating integrations and readings on the basis of a low resolution digital image of a papyrus of obscure provenance that nobody had physically inspected except the editor and few other people, and for not a long time. For me, it was methodologically wrong, as it was wrong, in my opinion, to publish following volumes and articles on the new Sappho that now look highly problematic, even when you have disclaimers like this one. And I want to mention, you know, the new bit of evidence that Mike Sampson has recently published in the Bulletin of the American Society of Papyrologists. That is another piece of interesting evidence about, you know, the our connections with the market. Very, very upsetting piece of evidence. Burris and Fish have stated recently in the article, in part, it comes also from the article that Ariel Sabar has published on the topic. So Burris and Fish have stated recently that they never had access to the largest fragment of the new Sappho, Pisaf Obbing. And the only occasion in which they handled the green Sappho fragments was actually during the staged retrieval at Baylor of January 2012. The edition was conducted on the basis of digital images. Most Sappho's experts don't have issues with the text from the philological point of view. I must thank publicly some of these colleagues who have introduced me to Sappho, in particular my colleague in my department at Manchester, Tom Phillips, but also Camillo Neri and Giambattista D'Alessio, who made a crash course on Sappho for me, and have gone through explanations of how, you know, these from the philological point of view, these seem to be Sappho verses. So it's something very different, for instance, from what we had in the case of the Jesus' wife papyrus, where when many experts in Coptic literature and language were raising a lot of concerns. However, the inaccessibility of the papyri and the way they came to light have irremediably muddled the state of scholarship. Nobody of us can have a look to this material because the largest fragment is nobody knows where, while the smaller are at the moment inaccessible. Perhaps they will become accessible once they will be given back to Egypt. Let's hope so. So the new Sappho risks to become another Artemidorus or Jesus' wife fragment nightmare. While these can many important differences, as I said before, they all have one thing in common. These texts have all surfaced recently from the market and have undocumented provenance. These texts should have not been published in the first place. It is as simple as that. So I think I have make an argument for, you know, the muddling of scholarship and not the advancement of scholarship. Now let's have a look at many other and perhaps more important reasons these should not have been published. The reasons why undocumented papyri recently emerged from the market should not be touched are not restricted to the negative impacts they have on scholarship and the production of knowledge. I would like to indulge on some details about the source of the new Sappho papyri in order to show these. Last summer, the Green Collection has circulated documents that you can download from Brent's blog, according to which their Sappho fragments that, as it has been argued by the editors, come from the same role as the largest fragment, Pisaf Obbink, have been bought by Hobby Lobby from a Turkish dealer named Jakub Exioglu on January 7, 2012. They were part of a lot of about 1,000 items. The purchase agreement details have been circulated last summer by Mike Holmes, director of the Green Scholar Initiative, and show how low the standards were in that collection at the time. I would like to stress and to make clear that the Green people's stream of conscience that we have witnessed in the last year and a half is not the result of Christian repentance that should have happened, but a strategy of damage control that was put in place as an answer of a long and complex police investigation that I believe is still ongoing. This said, I want to state publicly that there are positive forces inside the Museum of the Bible that the investigations actually have unleashed and made more powerful inside the museum. I am particularly grateful to Jeff Kloa, Mike Holmes, and curators like Hyland and others who have contributed to bring all these dealings, and there will be more to come, I believe, to light. But I think that what matters the most here is to give you a sense of what kind of people move papyri through the market. I met Mr. Jakub Exioglu without knowing that he was linked to the Sappho papyri. All I knew was that an eBay account called Mix Antique and later eBuyer was selling papyri and other Egyptian antiquities, and some ended up with Mr. Green. I was on chasing these Galatian fragments that had emerged from eBay, and I found at an exhibition in the Vatican in 2014, a few months after the announcement of the Sappho fragments. In the meanwhile, Candida Moss and Joel Baden showed in their 2017 monograph, Bible Nation, that there were flats in central London in which Green people like Scott Carroll, the ex-director of the Green Collection, went to look at manuscripts and mummy masks. In the spring of 2016, I established contact with a buyer, pretending to be a buyer, which was stupid, but useful. As we exchanged cell phone numbers, I Googled his number and discovered his identity immediately. Jakub Exioglu, a Turkish dealer, citizen living in Istanbul. It was very easy to realize that this seller was certainly not operating legally. Anyone could have understood it, even a stupid person. And in fact, I went straight to the Art and Antiquities unit of the London Metropolitan Police. As a result of investigations, the man was obviously upset, very upset, and threatened me of acid attacks later on in 2017. Exioglu is a bit of a character, as you can see, and also, you know, I didn't make his identity public until when actually the name was made, I believe, by Ariel in public in his Atlantic piece. So anytime you accept to publish an undocumented papyrus, you really need to be aware that in your fantasy, and it's really your fantasy, you may be a novel Grenfell, but you are not as good. But in reality, you are at the end of a chain of crimes that you legitimate through your work. The responsibility that you bear is enormous, as it involves serious violence. I'd like to recall here the fantastic work that Egyptian archaeologist Monica Hanna has conducted in recent years to document not only the extent of destruction and loss of cultural heritage, but the loss of Egyptian children's lives as they are employed for digging in shafts. Archaeological guards have been also killed by looters, and communities are threatened by this violence. So think about it. Let it sink down. Last March, Mr. Green has announced that he is sending his Egyptian manuscripts, including his Sappho fragments and other items, about 5,000 objects, back to Egypt in view of their provenance or lack of provenance. The museum has now only 16 papyri left, which are of legal provenance. But Mr. Green was not the only collector, so these are some of the items that are going back to Egypt. But Mr. Green was not the only collector to buy from Mr. Exioglu and perhaps other Turkish dealers, because it seems this to be a sort of network of more than one dealer. For instance, a Finnish collector, the owner of these so-called P-Ilves or Ilves, I don't even know how to pronounce these, has amassed a collection of over 1,000 pieces, and some at least are from Exioglu, as one of the editors has explained in an article recently published in Chronique d'Égypte, but there are other pieces out with other journals as well. The illegal market in antiquities will not be solved if we continue publishing papyri and other antiquities of undocumented provenance. Careful due diligence on the provenance of items must be performed before publication, meaning also public announcement like the one of 2014, and should be carefully vetted by editorial boards of series or journals. We are all in this together, even those of us who are, you know, in journal boards and so on. We all bear responsibilities in the process, which means that we need to raise our voices when we see that something is wrong with the provenance of a manuscript, even if it bears lines of Sappho or of Christian literature. And I like documents better, by the way. I started with the Egyptian friend of Petrie that was perfectly aware of the history of his own town. I want to come back to the question, as a conclusion, to the question of the colonial roots of our disciplines, because it is time to give that dumb man and his country their voice back. In recent years, there has been a big movement for reclaiming antiquities and restore justice in museums and universities' collections. I think that libraries are a little bit slow in this, but for instance, at Duke, something is happening thanks to Jennifer Knast, who is involving the librarians in a number of initiatives. We need to listen at this call and reflect upon its implications, which indeed are not easy to disentangle. The rewriting of narratives of discoveries and histories of papyrology and classics is most urgent, as I said, and there have been excellent steps forward, like Edith Hall's AHRC project or the handbook of classics and colonialism that everyday Orientalism in many ways is preparing for routledge. We need also to reflect on the status of manuscripts and their conceptualization. That is something that I deal with in that piece, that article, which is forthcoming at the beginning of the year. Teaching is indeed, that's another thing, teaching is indeed a key asset for change. So I do believe that the materiality of ancient texts should be better incorporated in our curricula, especially the most literary ones, and our past, I hope past, implications with colonialism and the illicit trade should be made much more explicit also there. The material turn I mentioned in the title is not confined to the very important issues of the preservation of archaeological evidence that illegal excavations threaten, but also a reflection on our relationship as academics with objects, including papyri, with biographies longer than ours. The way we handle ancient manuscripts is the result of our culture and our expectations, including academic promotions, as I have tried to explain, but has massive impacts on the manuscript's future and future generations' ability to study or appreciate them in other ways. I think that the field has to question past and present practices in order to find better ones, to rewrite more objective and inclusive narratives of discovery is just a first step we need to take. Thank you. I'm done.
Thank you very much, Roberta. That's a wonderful reminder of how connected something as supposedly academic and detached as a papyrus edition actually is to real people's lives in Egypt and in other countries as well. I'm going to open the floor up to questions now. If people have questions, please write them down and post them in the chat box at the side of the Zoom screen, and I will pass them on to Roberta. And if there's more than one question that deals with a similar topic, I hope people don't mind if I group them together slightly. But I'd like to take advantage of my position as chair and ask the first question, which I may have a little bit of difficulty phrasing, so please bear with me. But I was wondering, Roberta, about something you said at the close to the start of the talk about what it was like coming at this as a documentary papyrologist rather than a literary papyrologist. And I'm in the same boat as you are. I'm a documentary person who's never really thought about sort of the papyrus as a source of ancient literature very much. I like my literature in books, not papyri. But I was wondering whether you thought that this kind of literary documentary divide within papyrology had contributed in any way to some of the issues that we've had with things like the Sappho papyrus, Gospel of Jesus' Wife, and so forth.
Certainly, yes. Although, yes, because it's a sort of specialization that implies, different paths somehow. But what is mainly problematic for me is not much, what papyrologists in literary papyri are doing, which is, very similar to what we are doing, but the way that kind of work, let's say, like John Rylands' famous work on the Cologne Sappho, but also Daniela Colombo recently has co-authored a very important article on the materiality of one of these Sappho fragments in the Oxyrhynchus collection, is how that then is eventually reported or translated in some form in the literature, which is, in the commentaries, let's say, of, the standard edition of Sappho, you wouldn't find, many information about the materiality of text, but rather, proposal about the restoration of a verse or another. So that has contributed, in my opinion, to disentangle literature from the material that actually has transmitted that. So I found really, really fascinating the fact that, the first fragment of Sappho to be found is actually this very late antique piece of parchment that is not, what you would expect in terms of...
Yeah, and it's strange, isn't it, this failure to consider the materiality when we think about the fact that the material properties of the papyrus bear so directly on the reading of it. You know, is it an ink blot? Is it a piece of dirt on the thing in the glass and so forth? It's something we all ought to be much more in touch with.
I think
So we have a question from Alexandra Nagel in the chat, who asks whether, to your knowledge, any museum, small or big, has tried to sell the stories of theft of papyri and more. Tried to tell the stories of theft of papyri and more, also in Cairo. Wouldn't it be helpful to organise a travelling exhibit, for example, on this topic?
On the topic of what I'm not clear about, if the topic
let me I'll try and unpick this, and perhaps the question asker can let me know if I'm misinterpreting anything. The question, I think, is dealing with whether there have been any museum exhibits specifically about the theft of papyri.
Okay, so I think that actually what libraries and museums usually do is not, making a big public statements of what they lose. We have seen most recently some cases. Actually, I'm proud to say that the Egypt Exploration Society has been very, very open about what had happened in our collection, despite, we can say only some things because there is an investigation ongoing.
Yeah.
I think that many things can be done, like, telling stories. And actually, I am trying to do that with this new book that is this, The Secret Life of Manuscripts, that is about these things. Of course, the more we bring to light these problems, the better.
Absolutely. So, yeah. And I think especially in the UK, where both you and I are based, there's a lot of work to be done in helping museums to become more critically aware of the colonial basis of their own collection practices, to put it extremely politely.
Yeah, for instance, in Manchester, we are working hard with both, the Manchester Museum and the Rylands to bring all these old stories to light, and also to handle this material in fairer way, also with access, open access, and all these other issues that are connected.
So we have a question from Gregory Fuster, who says that he is struck by the parallels between the post-2011 period and the colonial period, where the destruction and looting of cultural heritage in Egypt is a call to action. Can you comment on those parallels? How do we avoid taking the posture once again of the white savior, etc.? And he thanks you for the talk.
And that's another of those moments of enlightenment that I had as well. If we, perhaps I can go back later to my slides with the with my work, but in one of my pieces, the online pieces, I received a lot of comments that were saying things like, Roberta, what are you talking about? Mr. Green has saved all these papyri from people who don't even understand their value. They are unable to take care of these documents and so forth, so on, which is exactly what Petrie somehow was, was writing in his journal. So the parallel is exactly that. I've argued these in some of my pieces, both online and also in publications. That is, we have never been post-colonial at some extent. So,
yeah, we haven't had our post-colonial moment yet. There are lots more questions coming in, so I've got to move on with these. One from Catherine Bluan, who wonders if you have thoughts on another phenomenon that she's noticed about literary papyri, namely the tendency to disconnect them from the Egyptian context they were produced and consumed in. This seems particularly striking regarding Alexandrian, Hellenistic and Roman literature and authors, which from what I know as a documentary person is embraced by philologists as Greek.
Yes, I mean, this is another, big issue, that is the use of these cultural or national adjectives in a very problematic way. But on the other hand, it is hard, to find alternatives. So I would be very much into changing practices also in that respect. I do my little part in my Greco-Roman Egypt, Egypt in the Greco-Roman world.
Yeah.
I titled my course, but we actually, even the students are really into this discussion, because it's hard then to find different narratives. But if you start, teaching these history courses bottom up, going first on the documents and then perhaps writing narratives, this is a work that can be done. So
yeah. And it's interesting as well to compare the task that we've got in teaching Egypt in the Greco-Roman period in universities in Egypt and North America with the Egypt itself about the awkward Greco-Roman period. What do you do with that? Really, Egyptians celebrate the pharaonic period, but you've got this awkward bit in the middle. And I think all of us have issues with this period, what we do with this wonderful kind of explosion of diversity in literary production that's difficult to assign to someone.
Sort of political way. So I tend to use, Ptolemaic and Roman, in the sense the Roman were, running the country. So
yeah. I've never liked the Romans. I'm sorry if there are any Romans present, by the way. Elena Chappell asks what your take would be on keeping a mask or mummy cartonnage as an object of Egyptian mass funeral culture versus dismantling it in an attempt to get new papyri with new texts out of it. Would there be an ethical problem in case, let's say, this mass cartonnage is legally acquired, not on eBay? Now, there's a question.
I think that I have expressed my opinion very clearly in many occasions. That is, as we are actually developing technologies that are allowing us to do fantastic things without dismantling material, I don't see any reasons why we should continue with this practice as we have done in the past. We have so much material outside cartonnage that is waiting to be published that, I don't see any reason, even in that respect, besides, the many ethical issues that there are with that. So I wouldn't.
Yeah, and I think you make a point there, which is very much worth reiterating for any non-papyrologists in the audience. There are so many unpublished papyri in collections. There is plenty to work on without dismantling cartonnage.
Yeah.
A question from Morag Kersel, who thanks you for your paper, as indeed everybody has. Given that the various papyrological associations have ethical guidelines and people still publish these dodgy pieces, what's to be done? What can we do better? There's another tough question.
It's not that tough, frankly. I think that the way some of us have, brought all these dealings to light, the way we didn't give up as people gave up perhaps in the past, and the support we have found in younger generations is making the job much better than, ethical guidelines that anyway we are actually revising as papyrologists at the moment. So I've seen a flurry of, activity surrounding ethical guidelines recently, and actually I'm very, very pleased to be part of Brill, ethical committees, and they have immediately reacted to all the critics, the critics that we have, you remember, moved with the public letter and so forth, so on. I believe more in culture than in guidelines. So the work that we are doing in our, public sphere, in publications, and also in the classroom, I believe in the classroom a lot, is making more of the job. I am optimistic, actually, also because there is the demography point, which is, as you know, the problem will be solved very soon with pension.
Yeah. If anybody would like to read the International Association of Papyrologists motion from about 13 years ago now about the trade in papyri, I've put a link to that in the text box, so you can follow that up.
Yeah, but we are revising those rules together with the international, both the association, the American Association Society, and the international. So.
Mm-hmm. Can I ask a little bit more about what you're teaching at the moment? What way do you bring papyri into teaching, for example, your course on Egypt in the Greco-Roman period? And can you say a bit about a challenge that I think many of us have, which is the question of teaching this material when we cannot expect students to have reached, a very high reading level in ancient languages?
I use them as objects, and even if you don't have the language, at least my students are bright enough to understand with a little bit of, guidance what's going on in the text. So for instance, for them is immediately interesting to see the presence of different handwritings, the shape of the letters is there. You don't have to know Greek to understand that an handwriting is, very elementary, or another is a very expert one, that the quality of the papyrus is excellent in respect with others. Actually, I found very easy to teach.
And again, it comes back to the material.
But what I found challenging somehow is using some of the data, the most specialistic databases that are not always, easy for people who are not specialized in Greek and in other.
Yeah, and again, it was like you were saying before, this comes back to the materiality of these objects being so useful as a way of getting people to understand them as things that were created by people holding a brush or a pen. Yeah. Dufault Olivier asks in the chat, I'm finding strange and suspiciously similar stories about finds of ancient libraries from the Theban area, Dishna papers, the Theban Magical, papyri, Nag Hammadi. What do we know about such finds? Are there more that I don't know with which we could compare them?
Well, I think that a good work, for instance, of Brenton Ongbury on God's libraries, so the Christian findings, including Nag Hammadi and others, have actually shown that these are all narratives of discovery, and there is very little in terms of reality. So in a sense, the market, the forces behind the market, and academics dealing with the market has muddled, the water even more. So in that respect as well. So there are people now spending all this time on so-called museum archaeology. But museum archaeology, I'm always laughing at this thing that is, of course, I'm doing museum archaeology as well to reconnect, dispersed material. But the dispersal was done by papyrologists. So this is really amazing, the way we didn't get that bit of the story. We are re-pulling together materials that have dispersed and on which we know little in terms of archaeology, because some before us has contributed to the market and the illicit digging. in this way.
And this is where archives come into such wonderful play as well. I'm thinking about the work that people like Brendan Haag have done on the letters about the papyrological connection at Ann Arbor, and then also what Fred Hagen and Kim Ryholt have done in Copenhagen, looking at antiquities dealers in Egypt in a particular period, from the papers of, I think it was a Danish or Norwegian collector called Lange. But there's so much about these personal relationships, isn't there, that's so crucial to what we do.
Yeah, I think that the book on the Lange papers was very, very helpful, because it's the first tool we have in order to, know much more about these the figures of the dealers. I want to be explicit also on this point, that is, these old papyrologists of the first generation were always accusing, the Egyptians and the diggers, the dealers, of destroying archaeological evidence. But many of them, actually, not many, but some of them actually were allowed by the Antiquities Service to excavate as, the foreigners. So it's a complex economy. It's a complex history, really, what we have to dig for, in which, the bad and the good is much more complex to be.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Francisca Nature is going back to something at the beginning of your talk, where you said that archaeology is assessing issues of colonial heritage of artifacts and so forth since the 1970s, in contrast to papyrology. Would you say the same is true for Egyptology and Near Eastern studies?
I'm not, that strong, and I haven't read as much as I should, perhaps, to express an opinion on Egyptology and Near Eastern studies, but I would say yes. I would tend to say yes. And archaeology also, also in archaeology, there are bad archaeologists, that is, but at least if you pick up the Oxford Handbook of Archaeology that was written at the same time the Oxford Handbook of Papyrology was written, in that volume you would find, plenty of chapters dedicated to the antiquities trade and the colonial past and so forth, so on. In the Oxford Handbook of Papyrology, a little bit less. The article of Jim Keenan on the history of papyrology has raises some concerns, but we didn't do a very good job because of the texts. I think that that being interested in texts somehow brought people into this disconnection between the object and the text, because in any case, the focus was the text. Yeah. People wanted to know what is written on it.
Text does this to people, it's crazy.
Yes,
so Katrine has a question about Medea Norsa, who I wanted to ask about as well. She says that she very much appreciated the segment of your talk about her. Do you know if more work is being done currently to centre her voice and contributions to scholarship? And then she asks the same question for the locals of Bathnassa.
So on Medea Norsa, there is little. That is, of course, there is Camphora and his group. They have always, looked at the history of scholarship in Italy, and they have produced amazing work of excavating into the archives. Also, Rosario Pintaudi has brought to light this material in the 90s, actually, those letters, bodies of letters, exchanges between all these people, including Medea Norsa. But I think that actually there has been a big misconception about Medea Norsa. That is that fragment of my talk in which I brought to light what has happened to her in terms of academic, career, nobody has touched upon it except for a biography, for a sort of online biography that one of my old teachers, actually Lucia Criscuolo, has written about her. But as with anything involving, you know, women, somehow there has been very little. Actually, I wanted to present a paper on this story, but it was rejected.
Wow. And it's the tricky intersectionality thing with Medea Norsa as well, doubly disadvantaged in the period in which she was living by being both Jewish and female. And
you know, in her case, the bad thing was to be a female, not a Jew, which is interesting, very interesting.
Yeah. I remember seeing a while ago, there was a very moving report in, I think it was the Journal of Egyptian Archaeology by H.I. Bell, reporting to people shortly after the war that she was alive and well.
Yeah, she was alive and well, and then she was an adjunct till when she died. And then, a few months after, the first chair in papyrology was created. Events, it's factual.
Yeah. We have another question from Franco De Angelis, who says that he hasn't read Canforas il Papiro di Dongo, but he will after this talk. And I was wondering if what affected Medea Norsa was not only Italy's adoption of racial laws in March 1938, but also the anti-ancient Greek sentiment that affected a lot of scholarship in pro-ancient Rome, fascist Italy.
I don't think so. If you would read, once you will have read Camphora, you will appreciate that actually fascists were crazy about papyri, so very interested in you know, the Egyptian sort of adventure. So I do think that actually the problem with Norsa was that she was a woman, and a brilliant woman, actually. One who had a very close intellectual relationship with Vitelli, who was the big father of everyone. She was gifted. Italian men don't like gifted women, not even now. I think that we have in Italy the ratio between, you know, women in ordinario, full professorship and lower ranks must be even, you know, upsetting, so to speak.
Lorelei van der Heijden adds that it's good to know that misogyny is stronger than anti-Semitism.
Well, in Italy sometimes. Yeah.
Are there any more questions? Lucia has a question. You mentioned the interpretive problems we find in the wake of the volume published by Brill on the newest Sappho fragments. I'm writing my extended essay on the Brothers poem. Do you have any recommendation on how I should approach the fact that the papyrus is not being seen by the scholars publishing their interpretations on the fragment?
Lucia, if you don't have any problem working on a text, integrations without having seen the papyrus, I don't know, I mean, what to say. That is, I don't really know what to say. I would, if, let's make this example. Let's imagine that the Sappho fragment was not about Sappho, but the Epion's archive, which is one of a document, right? I wouldn't, I mean, I want to see the papyrus at this point of the story, because we continue talking about something that nobody has seen, and but I'm not, I mean, I'm not saying to people what to do. You are free, very welcome to, you know, on that if you think that it is possible. I wouldn't.
It's an ethical conversation we all need to have, and this applies not just to Egypt but to other regions as well. I work on Afghanistan, where a lot of the material has come out in tragic war-related circumstances onto the antiquities market, and there are things that are not publicly accessible. And I completely agree. If we don't all address this, then what on earth are we doing? We're just building a house on sand here.
Yes, and also, you know, the quality, I mean, if you know, let's make the case of the Cologne Sappho, okay? You don't have the access to the papyrus, but you could go to Cologne and have access to it, right? You can't do the same with the P. Sappho Hobbing. You can't. Would you trust, after all what has happened, after Mike Sampson's article, are you trusting those images? I don't.
I mean, I've got to say, I'm in complete agreement with all of this. If I haven't seen it, it ain't real.
If you are comfortable, you are comfortable. I wouldn't.
But if I take it now, perhaps Lucia can correct me if I'm wrong, but if you're writing a piece of work for a degree or qualification at university, I think a lot depends on who's going to be marking things, and I think it is important to acknowledge this kind of thing because it's the field we're all operating in.
It's, you know, it's a personal decision. I should admit this, and I've always been open to different opinions on the matter. But my opinion is that perhaps, you know, it's better to work on something else and see what will happen, because this papyrus can surface at some point, I don't know. And once, you know, the green fragments will be given back to Egypt, I don't see anything, you know, problematic about studying those fragments. And it's important, you know, that Egypt will provide access to those fragments once they will be back. And I hope that, you know, also the other papyrus will be surfacing at some point.
Absolutely.
At that point, I will go back, Lucia, to your article.
That sounds like good advice. Well, if there are no more questions, perhaps we ought to let Roberta have a very well-earned rest. What time is it where you are now? Have you had dinner yet?
7:25. No, it's Italian.
Oh, dinner's for later. So if people would like to applaud, I see some people are clicking the buttons to do that already. If you'd like to turn on your microphone and applaud, that's also totally appropriate now.
Oh, thank you so much for coming. Thank you so many friends. So wonderful to have this. It's so good to see you all on the screen. Fantastic.
So thank you so much, Roberta, for such a wonderful paper again. And Katrina Osama and I would like to thank everybody who's been part of the Everyday Orientalism talk series, both our speakers and our audience members over the last few months. It's been a wonderful journey, and we're really privileged to have had the kinds of conversations with Roberta and our guests today, and all sorts of other people as well. We've got lots of thank yous for Roberta coming in the chat box as well, which I will pass on. I will save the text file and send it to her.
Guys, for organizing this series, which is amazing, and which will be very useful for teaching. Very, very. Thanks. Well done.
Thank you very much. Bye, everyone. Take care.
Bye, everyone.
Happy holiday season.
You too.